Is the projected African century about to begin? Many had forecast the 21st century would see the continent undeniably on the rise, but with multiple military coups, destabilizing internal conflicts, and limited economic growth, what are the prospects for what will be the world's largest and youngest workforce? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Africa. With its resources and youthful population, Africa has tremendous potential. But time and time again, that potential has been squandered, not least by a lack of development and corruption. Still, hopes are high that in the coming years, the continent will become an engine for global growth. But could previously unforeseen challenges, including massive aid cuts, make Africa's burgeoning population, expected to be the largest workforce by 2035, a liability rather than a blessing? Here's a look.
Arguably, no other continent on Earth shows as much potential and as much promise as Africa. The population, with a median age of under 20 in many countries, is seen as one of its strongest assets. The potential for future development, fertile land, expanding urban centres, and growing innovation point to a future where Africa could become the most competitive industrial region on the planet. Except, when looking at them individually, many African nations can't seem to get out of their own way. In 2025, what's been labelled as an epidemic of coups struck several nations, mainly in West Africa. In December alone, Guinea-Bissau and Benin had their governments pushed to the brink.
The instability in Guinea-Bissau and the attempted coup d'etat in Benin remind us that democracy requires constant vigilance and principled action.
Coups are not limited to those two countries, nor are the list of problems African nations face limited to coups alone. In Mali, the national capital, Bamako, is being held to ransom by violent insurrectionists and rebels blocking fuel trucks and supplies to the city. Their aim, ousting a junta that took power in a coup of its own back in 2021. People queue for hours to wait for fuel that sometimes fails to arrive at skyrocketing prices few can now afford. Meanwhile, years of war in Sudan meant that by June of this year, the number of refugees fleeing reached a new high.
4 million people now have fled to Sudan into neighboring country since the start of the war, now in its third year. The 4 million people, a devastating milestone in what is the world's most damaging displacement crisis at the moment.
Aging leaders in countries where elections appear more rubber stamp than legitimate democratic exercise are proving hard to dislodge. Cameroon's most recent election saw the return to power of Paul Biya, the oldest non-hereditary head of state anywhere in the world. At 92, he's now on to his 8th term of office, and could be 99 by the time this term ends.
One of the major things that worry me is at the level at which the current regime, the government, has a foothold in the electoral process. It makes you lose hope in the idea that you can vote and have a candidate.
It's not the only African nation to have never-changing elderly leaders. Amid the threats of war or civil war, international security failures, corruption, famine, inequality and instability, the promise of Africa's bright future can only rest in the hands of its young, frustrated populations.
So how promising is the future for Africa, and will the African century be realized? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from New York, co-founder of the Program on African Social Research at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs, Zachariah Mampilly. From Dakar, security analyst at the Control Risks Consultancy, Beverly Ochieng. And from London, Africa director at the European Council on Foreign Relations, Alex Vines. Thanks all so much for being with me. Let's begin, if we can, with the glass being half full proverbially. And Zachariah, what gives you the most hope for the future of the continent?
Well, definitely the young population has been showing that it's very discontented with the current situation, politically and certainly economically as well. They've taken to the streets, as I'm sure we'll talk about today, in many different parts of Africa. That's been going on now for over a decade. And I think, ultimately it's an unstable and potentially violent situation, but also one that demonstrates that people are deeply engaged and are hopeful for a different kind of trajectory from the current situation. And that gives me some hope.
Okay, a little bit of irony there, but Beverly, would you agree?
I mean, in some ways, yes. I think there's a force to re-examine where Africa stands, especially now that the West is diverting attention. We've seen a lot more aid being moved towards defense in Europe, for instance, for Ukraine, the US shutting down US aid. But it does mean that African countries have to consolidate their own internal resources. They have to be more strategic about who they allow to invest, how they diversify their partnerships, as they've been putting it, because social unrest will be one of the biggest triggers and pressures on governments to ensure that they respond to demands by young people for social reforms, political reforms, as well as public services of high quality.
Okay, Alex, what is your take?
Compared with 20 years ago, a lot of the big wars are over. More connected, it's urban, it's youthful. More foreign direct investment moving into the African continent. Plenty of good news as well as problems, but you'd expect that is as vast as the African one with 54.
Okay, Alex, I have to apologize again. We seem to be having problems with your audio, but let's see if we can get that corrected. And I'll come back to Zachariah then, because the question now is, I mean, you pointed out a little bit of irony, as I mentioned in your answer. So is the growing population a blessing or is it a liability? Because, yes, you'll have a burgeoning young workforce. They're demanding social change. But if they're still just lacking skills and education, they won't have opportunities. And the government is not likely to provide for them.
Yeah, I would say that, the two positions you sketched out, whether we think of a youth bulge as a boon or a potential risk for these societies is a fairly common one. I'm certainly on the side of, demographic change is hugely important. Most regions in the world are not growing anymore. Africa is a uniquely young population. If we look across the continent, we see that this young population is extremely motivated. They are not apathetic in any sense. They're deeply invested in trying to create better futures for themselves and for their countries. And so for me, I think, unequivocally, this is a resource that is available to states, to governments around the continent. But unfortunately, too many governments have viewed their populations as a threat. And I would say the same for much of the international community. If we look at the European Union, we look at the West in general, there is increased measures put in place to deter Africans from traveling to their countries to study, to pursue work opportunities, and so on. And so I think we need to, reconfigure how we understand the role of this young population and what potential they may possess, and how that could not only shape the future of Africa, but I think the entire human population.
Yeah, it would. I mean, this does inform the entire globe, especially in countries where there is such dramatic inequality. But Beverly, the mention of these governments, certain governments viewing their young population as a threat, I mean, can they relieve some of that threat by getting an education and really investing in the youth? Or is that what they're cynically trying to avoid?
I mean, on one hand, you do have governments that are proactively investing in their youth, that they're opening opportunities for them, whether it's in industry, manufacturing, upskilling. I think countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, for instance, Ghana, Nigeria are becoming more conscious that they do need to have a skilled population to keep them satisfied. But on the other hand, we're also seeing that there's an increase in repression in certain countries, whereby young people are definitely demanding a lot more in terms of political representation, but instead their governments are taking their voices away. So we're seeing this increasingly in countries within the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. We see that to some extent in Ethiopia. We see this to some extent even in Kenya itself, where the crackdown on protesters for simply demanding that they want social services, better security, better health, better education. So it's about how governments deal with it, whether through repression or being more responsive.
Let me ask you, Beverly, if you think that too much promise promise given to these populations was derived actually from growth that was based in the past on demand from China and very high global commodity prices, both of which proved to be not the most sustainable.
I mean, it's true. We're going into a very uncertain period where tariffs are suddenly heightened, where there are restrictions on people being able to move to other countries to study or work, where even countries that have been trying to increase their investments on the continent, like China, has to think about its debt burden and whether it can actually take more of that on. And even countries that are increasingly putting in resources on the continent are not necessarily thinking about it as a way of increasing the skills gap or technical capacity within. And then there's also the bit that African young people are innovating for themselves because they do realize that where the government is not providing and where the industry has become a lot more closed, they do need to fill in that gap. We're seeing innovations with drone technology in Rwanda and Cameroon for delivering medication, for instance. We're seeing innovations with fintech and financing, being able to move money across different parts of the continent to enable people to even just sustain their livelihood. So it's not just about Africans themselves waiting. They're also innovating in an active environment where they realize that a lot of global resources are being shut out for their access.
Okay, Alex, let me ask you this. West Africa is now known as the coup belt. The prospect for war in East Africa is looming, not least between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And the extremism that exists, ranging from Somalia to Mozambique to Nigeria to the Sahel, is destabilizing vast areas. So which part of the continent would you identify as having the greatest risk versus the greatest promise?
I think the Horn of Africa is particularly alarming. As mentioned, there could be a conflict in 2026 between Eritrea, let alone the devastating conflict that is ongoing in Sudan. Sahel obviously is a problematic area, which over effects onto coastal states, but there are parts that have resilience. Southern Africa in particular, some of the coastal states. I would encourage investors to look at Côte d'Ivoire. There's a lot of finance looking to maybe invest in that. Has some debt problems at the moment, but there's still longer term.
Okay.
So the picture is mixed.
Alex, again, we're going to have to see if we can correct your connection because there's a pretty severe audio problem there. So let me pass that question as well on to Zachariah. Is there a specific area that you really fear could derail progress being made in a way that affects the entire continent? I mean, we've spoken a lot in recent months about the coup belt and the issues particularly in West Africa and the Sahel. Is that where you'd see it, or are there other issues, perhaps in East Africa, that concern you more?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, I think first, there are sort of two long-standing conflicts on the continent that I think continue to have very dramatic spillover effects. The Sudan crisis has been ongoing now for 2 or 3 years. It's certainly far from resolved. It has been an extraordinarily brutal conflict involving a huge number of external actors that don't seem particularly motivated to find any sort of peaceful resolution. Sudan is a huge country. It is bordered by many other countries. And I think unless the international community really starts paying attention to Sudan, it has a tremendous potential to spill over beyond the country itself and destabilize other somewhat already unstable countries in the region. I think the same thing is happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This has been a place where there's been war now for over a quarter century. You continue to have players like Rwanda and Uganda that are intervening in the conflict in Congo in ways that are, I think, tremendously threatening, have the potential, again, to spill over into the broader Central African region in ways that could be tremendously destabilizing. I think that when it comes to the question of the coup belt, it's useful to distinguish between two types of coups that have been taking place across the continent, particularly in the West African and Sahel regions. On one side, you have coups that are really about sort of preserving the old regime. So that's the kind of coup that we saw in places like Zimbabwe or in Sudan, largely people from within the regime who are trying to hold on to power due to either an aging or out-of-touch leader. And so they orchestrate a coup to secure power for themselves. There are some other formations of coups in the West African context in particular that I am, willing to hold judgment on. These are, of course, the coups in places like Burkina Faso, Niger, where you have a much younger set of leaders who have potentially revolutionary aspirations. I'm not necessarily endorsing their politics in any way. I have real concerns about what they're doing. But I think it's important to recognize that these were not elements of the old regime, but rather young people who have a fair amount of popularity in the region and whose politics are certainly harder to pin down and I think are potentially interesting, hopefully can moderate over time and produce something different than what has been unfolding in the region for a while now.
Beverly, I'd like to go back to something you mentioned, actually, and the issue of aid being cut on a pretty mass scale to various countries throughout the continent. Does the loss of aid help or hinder the development? Because we know the arguments from earlier, there was a period of time when it was talked about how, Dead Aid was one of the better selling books about it and how it was actually holding Africa back. But now that the aid is gone, we're talking about how rates of poverty can easily increase. People are being left more vulnerable because they won't have access to food, healthcare, et cetera, and making them even vulnerable to the extremism that can exist in countries from Mozambique to Somalia. Go ahead, yeah.
I mean, yeah, definitely, because aid was mostly fitting in the social services, particularly about public health, if you think about whether it's counterinsurgency in terms of being able to allow societies to be better integrated. This is going to be a huge gap. And we might have a bit of a gap here as African countries try to realign their budgets and think about where they need to fill in these gaps. But then they've also been innovations. I think during COVID-19 in particular, vaccine R&D, production and clinical research became a lot more robust on the continent and people becoming more self-reliant in terms of their health architecture. So we've been able to keep off massive epidemics such as Ebola, for instance, Rift Valley fever that's happening here in Senegal, Mpox across the continent. The shutdown of aid means that African countries have to re-examine their budgets and their spending and really put in concerted efforts on social spending. And that means that that pressure is completely aligned across the board. HIV supply chains will be undermined, but then they will need to recover. And humanitarian activities in fragile countries are critical areas where governments will likely be looking to prioritize spending, also as a means of forestalling social unrest.
Beverly, if I can, I'd like to ask you, I don't know too much about your background, but I do know that you are a young African woman. And I want to ask, what allowed you to get the skills and opportunities that it seems too many, I guess, of your contemporaries really haven't had? And is it possible to maybe scale the model that you were raised with and apply it to the broader population?
I mean, it's true, there's lots of gaps generally in terms of education. For instance, I was lucky enough to be able to get certain scholarships to be able to finish school, but also be able to, have a family that was very supportive. It's very rare, of course, for many young women to be able to get many opportunities. And I think governments are being more proactive about making sure that women are part of the equation in terms of being able to get education, skills, being in the labor force, being visible and being part of the solution. That's one thing. It's also about socioeconomic class. I always make jokes that I'm probably one paycheck away or one health crisis away from being in complete poverty. The African middle class is very fragile. It is growing because industries are growing, because skills gaps are changing significantly. But for instance, I would say informally, I support someone who takes care of my child. If I'm jobless, it means that they don't have work. It means that the government can also not support them by extension. So that middle class is not just supporting itself, but supporting a broad cross-section of society in many instances where governments are not necessarily providing direct support or direct contribution. It is still crucial to ensure that skill gaps are high enough for people to work and for that to consolidate across the economic strata.
Right. The skills gaps are incredibly intimidating, actually. And it's interesting that you say even the middle class is fragile. Alex, I'm going to try you one more time and hope that your connection can hold up, because the problem with that fragility, if even the middle class is there, what does that say about the poorer classes, especially when there are extremists that we mentioned throughout the continent that are really looking to capitalize on the desperation of poverty?
Yes, extremists are capitalizing on the poverty indicators have deteriorated. COVID them, so there are actually deeper pockets of poverty now on the continent than there was 5 years ago. So this is alarming, and it clearly Marshall for extremism across the Mozambique or the East African coast or in the Sahel. This lifting people, providing equitable economic growth is a policy priority.
Yeah.
There are some states that are much more effective at this. So you'd need to look at Rwanda, actually. Here, Morocco has been very successful. Of course, that raises further expectations. And as some of your other speakers in demonstrations, as youth in particular, need an experience. The demonstrations in Morocco, I think, are a good example of that.
Raising expectations and managing expectations. I mean, Zachariah, we know many African leaders have been calling in this global context right now for inclusive growth globally, and how much that will matter to help the younger African population also participate in the global economy and prosper along with global growth. The problem is more and more developed and powerful economies are looking at protectionism and isolationism rather than this inclusive global growth. Where does that leave the continent?
I would say in a very tricky position. I mean, if we look at the green transition that is ongoing in much of the world right now, many of the minerals that are essential, things like cobalt, lithium, that undergird battery technology are all coming from the continent. As you mentioned earlier, African economies are uniquely commodity dependent. They rely very heavily on resource extraction, and those resources are fueling the global economy. But they don't necessarily create, the kinds of jobs that can bring people out from poverty into the middle classes. And so I think, as Beverly made clear, we have very precarious class positions, especially for the middle and lower classes on the continent. They're engaged in sectors like mining and mineral extraction that are highly unstable, that don't necessarily produce the kind of industrialized or formal sector jobs that we would like to see, that allow people to leave poverty in a more durable fashion. And so I think the international community has a big role to play here in terms of the way in which we absorb African resources into the supply chain, and yet, as the images you're demonstrating right now show, are not providing opportunities for people who produce those minerals to exit very, very deep poverty. And I think African governments as well have a role to play here. The problem with commodity production is that the real value often is concentrated in a very small set of economic elites who often have very close ties to the political elites.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing is a massive spike in inequality around the continent. As recently as the 1990s, African countries were poor, but they were relatively equal. If you look at the economic picture across Africa today, we see some of the most unequal countries in the world are on the African continent. And much of that has to do with the fact that it is so that African countries are so dependent on commodities, and that enables very, very narrow elites to benefit the most, while preventing any sort of redistribution to the general population. And I think that's something that has to be reconfigured.
Yeah, Beverly, how much do you fear that the continent will get somehow stuck in this, permanent, it seems, developing world kind of dynamic, whereby you'll often hear leaders bragging about better GDP numbers and economic growth, while they leave huge swathes of their population in the most kind of humiliating poverty, and it just becomes accepted?
I mean, yeah, exactly. You cannot eat GDP, you cannot eat lower inflation rates. And right now, especially with a more transactional relationship with the West and even with China and Russia and other countries, this is going to continue being a cycle of either dependency or underdevelopment. At the moment, with the way the US is positioning itself, for instance, whereby you must prioritize US businesses to be able to benefit from, our financial opportunities, it just means that extractive relationship continues to replicate itself. In theory, African countries are trying to build more regulatory measures that would allow skills, technical gaps to be developed within the continent, for those resources to be useful in the country. But the truth is, in many instances, it's the political elite and the business elite who do continue to benefit at the detriment of other people who would be the ones holding up the wider society.
Okay. Beverly, I will have to give you the final word and apologize to Alex because unfortunately we could not get your line corrected in the end. But really, thank you all three of you so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Incredibly insightful conversation. And thanks so much to our viewers as well for joining us as always. Remember, you can follow us on social media and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.